Welcome to today's Association of the United States Army Thought Leader podcast, Strategic Competition with Russia and China, Implications for the U.S. Army in Europe. This is Colonel Retired Dan Roper, AUSA's Director of National Security Studies. I will be serving as your host. To address this set of complex interconnected issues, we're fortunate to be joined today by Peter Doran, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, the leading research institute dedicated to the study of Central East Europe and Russia. A recognized expert on Russia and Ukraine, transatlantic defense, and energy security, Peter has written for Time, Foreign Policy, Defense News, National Review, and the American Spectator, and his analysis has been featured in Fox News, Wall Street Journal, and Newsweek. Peter, welcome to today's AUSA's Thought Leaders podcast.
Thank you, Colonel. I'm happy to be here.
Before we tackle some questions related to our topic, could you please tell us a little bit about CEPA?
Sure, absolutely. So CEPA, my organization, got started about 15 years ago with the idea that there needed to be a center of research and learning on those intermediate lands between Berlin and Moscow. Our idea was that this was not a settled strategic theater of competition. If you look at the map, this part of the world, Central Eastern Europe, was where the wars of the last century began. It's where the genocide occurred. It's where the ideological battles between East and West were fought. And in a post-9/11 world, there was a lot of focus on other theaters of competition. And we had a belief that this part of the world, Central Eastern Europe, mattered, and we needed to develop experts and a deeper understanding of Central Eastern Europe in order to help policymakers make smart decisions. Vladimir Putin, unfortunately, proved all of our investment theses correct.
Thanks, Peter. I'd like to set a little bit of context here for our discussion. And for nearly 2 decades, the U.S. military has focused on low-tech adversaries in the Middle East, yet it now finds itself out of position and potentially overmatched by near-peer competitors with select modernized capabilities. The United States National Defense Strategy, released in February 2018, asserts that the central challenge to U.S. prosperity and security is reemergence of long-term strategic competition by revisionist powers, namely Russia and China. So to provide the context for our discussion, it would be helpful if you could briefly describe the evolution of the NATO-Russia relationship since the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997.
Well, I think if you look at the National Defense Strategy, the immediate takeaway is that this NDS encompasses many ideas whose time has come. There was, as we know, nearly 2 decades in which the United States was committed to out-of-area operations, counterinsurgency operations, and those missions were important. But what the NDS does is it retools conceptually, as well as at the equipment level, the personnel level, and the strategic level. It retools how the Pentagon, and by extension the United States, is looking at the world. And when we look around the world, we see trouble. We see that the United States can no longer rest on its laurels. We can't take the traditional advantages we've enjoyed for many years for granted anymore. Technology is changing rapidly, and our peers are catching up. So with this in mind, the National Defense Strategy says, all right, we need to be very serious about competition with Russia and China. Specifically in Europe, though, we have a problem. Because if you roll back the clock mentally, imagine that we have a time machine and we go back to 1997. We see a pivotal moment. We see a document called the NATO Russia Founding Act. This was essentially not a treaty per se, but it was a agreement between Russia and members of the NATO Alliance. And it said, based on the strategic conditions of 1997, we're actually in a pretty good spot right now. We're not in a Cold War. We're not feeling threatened by you, Russia, and the same from Russia's perspective. So based on this, we can make certain assumptions, and we'll commit to those assumptions, such as not deploying permanent forces east of Berlin, a few others, but based on the assumption that as long as the conditions of 1997 remain the same, we have no need to be worried about you, Russia. Fast forward to 2008, when Russia broke the conditions of 97 by invading its neighbor with force and attempting to redraw a border through force of arms. Fast forward again to 2014, when we saw the illegal annexation of Crimea and an ongoing war in the Donbass region, which has killed more than 13,000 people. The conditions of 1997 are long gone, and our national defense strategy and some other documents are now coming to terms with how much has changed in Europe, and we're having to play some catch-up right now. That's where we stand, and that's how the table is set for us.
Further into the NDS, it talks about Russia is seeking veto authority over nations on its periphery in terms of the governmental, economic, and diplomatic decisions. It seeks to shatter NATO and change the European and Middle East security and economic structures to its favor. Its use of emerging technologies to subvert democratic processes in Georgia, Crimea, and eastern Ukraine that you alluded to is very concerning. And when coupled with its expanding and modernizing nuclear arsenal, the challenge is clear. How would you describe Russia's regional strategy to contain, undermine, and reverse NATO's influence in Eastern Europe?
Well, this is a topic which is near and dear to my heart because myself and one of my co-authors at CEPA, a fellow named Donald Jensen, and I, we wrote a piece on this, and we called it Chaos as a Strategy. And what we did was we actually unpacked what Russian strategic thinkers are saying and tried to answer a fundamental question. What is Russia trying to accomplish here? Well, whenever you try and ask that question, it's like opening up a Pandora's box and new analytical questions pop out and you want to answer all sorts of different questions. But in order to really get at what Russia's playing at, you have to understand more fundamentally, what do Russian strategic planners fear? And when you look at how they have structured their means of competing against us, we realize they fear our power. They fear our elements of state power. And they are using the one or two remaining assets they have at their disposal to maximum advantage, often running circles around us. So when we look at what's happening, we see that Russia is attempting to export chaos in the West as a counterbalancing strategy. If you are weak and your opponent is strong, well, you have to balance out that ledger. Now, as it has been pointed out by myself and others, this is not necessarily a new strategy. You can go back to Sun Tzu and the Art of War and see elements of this strategy presented. You can look at great strategists throughout history like Clausewitz and others, and each of them have adapted or contributed to this idea of using chaos for strategic effect. But what has occurred in Russia is that some of Russia's strategists have married 21st century technology to some very old concepts in grand strategy. And what has resulted is this effort to leverage to the maximum Russia's few remaining elements of national power in order to balance out our relative power against Moscow. This is a very tricky situation because it's different than the kind of competition we had in the Cold War. It's different than aligning giant military forces against each other. And in understanding what we're dealing with, we argue that Russia's strategy can be defeated, that every strategy has a weakness, even chaos. And there are some smart ways in which we can defeat Russia's strategy to sow chaos in our midst.
Could you talk a little bit further about how Russia's been weaponizing energy and how it's been weaponizing cyber in levels that are, again, below the threshold of open conflict?
Well, this is the real weakness we have, because our way of thinking about warfare is very different than a Russian worldview. So, for example, when we think about warfare in the Western mind, we think, well, there's conventional and non-conventional and nuclear, and we make these distinctions of category about the kinds of warfare that we might fight. The types of warfare that we might engage in. But when it comes to the Russian worldview, they don't make any of those distinctions. The natural Russian inclination is to view everything as just an element of power. So there are there are few distinctions between low threshold conflict, like you mentioned, and high-end conflict. It's all just war. Now, when we look at how Russia is leveraging assets like energy security or the social media space, we see that we have a problem. Because Russia is using, for example, its energy resources to wield inappropriate economic and political influence over members of the NATO alliance. We've seen political cutoffs of energy for strategic effect by Russia in years past. We see the unfortunate negative influence of what my colleague Brian Whitmore at CEPA calls dark money. And we see that Russia is using its non-military means of state power to wield influence over our allies in Europe. That is a very, very dangerous thing because it's hard to counteract. Not impossible, but it's difficult. And more importantly, it is in the Russian worldview, in the Russian mindset, a means of war. And this is the biggest problem we face right now in Europe, is that when we think of our competition with Russia, we don't see ourselves at war. But when you look at the Russian national security strategy, and you look at some of the work of their pioneering strategic thinkers, they see themselves in a war footing against us. There is a deep asymmetry here that we have to come to terms with. It's happening slowly, but obviously I'd like to see it accelerate.
At a slightly more granular level, what lessons is Russia learning from their war in Ukraine? Because they've been there since 2014, and it's essentially become a proving ground for their different new techniques and capabilities. And it'd be interesting to understand a little bit more about what they think about it.
Well, when we look at Ukraine, we have to understand Ukraine in much the same way we would think about the Spanish Civil War in the last century, or even the Arab-Israeli War in 1973. Ukraine is a testbed conflict where new concepts, technologies, methods of war fighting are being experimented with. And there are a few important lessons we can draw from what we've seen already. The first one is send in the drones. We have seen incredibly active use of unmanned aerial vehicles, as well as a war to put the vehicles up in the air and take them down. So there's a very intense fight between the different forces to manage the air battle space. I think that's the first one. The battle space is very complex, and it's relying heavily on UAVs. We have seen a tremendous return to the use of artillery, but more importantly, the need for high mobility in artillery because of the merger of drones and communications with artillery. If you stand in one place for a very short period of time, the chances you're going to die increase exponentially. So our artillery is back, but it needs to be mobile. Perhaps the last one is that we have to come to terms in the alliance as a whole with the big deficiencies of the infantry fighting vehicle. Let me say this, Ukraine has a lot of old Soviet-era equipment, Soviet-era IFVs, as we'd call them. Many of our other allies in NATO, such as Poland and Slovakia, have last-gen IFVs. Going to battle as a Ukrainian soldier in a last-gen IFV is a great way to die. IFVs of the last generation in the Soviet stockpiles are so dangerous, Ukrainian soldiers enter battle riding on top of their vehicles, not inside them, because it's easier in the event that someone starts shooting at you just to jump off. It's a death sentence to stay inside. So we have to, again, look at this conflict in Ukraine as a testbed conflict where we're learning what works, what doesn't work anymore, and what could be perfected in the future when it comes to UAVs, the increased use of artillery, and too much reliance on last-gen equipment to achieve an operational objective.
Thank you. That provides some good context for some corresponding steps the U.S. Army's been taking to try to wake up and understand the implications of how warfare the character is changing, not necessarily the nature, but
correct,
how it's being fought at the ground level looks a little different in some cases. Shifting a little bit, it may come as a surprise to many, but China's involvement in Europe has also been significant. So could you describe their objectives and activities that China's been pursuing that are potentially detrimental to the United States' national security interests?
Well, this is where we really start to see how the 21st century field of strategic competition is taking place, is shaping up, let me say. When we think of Russia competition, okay, we naturally think Europe. When we think of Chinese competition, we naturally think Asia. But increasingly what we're seeing is that Europe is a theater of strategic competition with China. Right now, many folks in America don't know this, but China owns 10% of all the ports in Europe. And relationships with China come with hidden strings. So the Chinese will approach a country and say, hey, we want to buy your infrastructure. We want to build out your roads and rail networks for you. And this money that we're offering is without strings. But of course, that's not true. And there are lots of underexplored risks we face, such as using greater Chinese activity in Europe for espionage activities, for stealing technology by, rather than, well, look at it this way. If you are a Chinese company and you need new technology to compete with the West, you don't even have to steal it anymore. You just have to buy the Western company that has that tech. And now that tech is yours. So we actually are at a disadvantage if we don't view Europe as a theater of competition with China. Now, the good news here is that we have put forward some means to compete. The Chinese have this concept called the 16+1 format. It's essentially their means of engaging with European countries, politically, economically, etc. We have this idea of the 3 Cs, imagining the 3 Cs of Europe, the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Sea. And this 3 Cs concept is one great way in which we can counteract the rise of Chinese influence in Europe. I am encouraged to see our State Department and other leaders in the administration take seriously the fact that we are competing with China globally, but I'd like to see much more attention directed at Europe as a theater of competition with China. If we ignore that, we do ourselves great peril.
Now let's talk a little bit about the NATO alliance and the U.S. role in the NATO alliance. In the most recent edition of Foreign Affairs, Michael Mandelbaum observed that after the Soviet collapse, many Cold War arrangements persisted through inertia and gained support because they seemed to entail little expense or risk. Now that the expenses and risks of such a policy have increased, many Americans may reconsider their support. What do you make of this? And more specifically, how does America benefit from its military presence in Europe?
So that's an interesting quote. And when I was thinking about this quote, I remember reading it, and I would say this. I would agree with the first part, but not the last part of that quote. So would you repeat that for listeners there so we can unpack this one? Because it's important.
The first part is after the Soviet collapse, many Cold War arrangements persisted through inertia and gained support because they seemed to entail little expense or risk.
Correct.
And now the second part. Now that the expenses and risks of such a policy have increased, many Americans may reconsider their support.
Incorrect.
Okay. I'll let Michael know.
Right. So the first part is right. Think back in that, remember we talked about that time machine where we could go back to the world of 1997. Sure, a lot of this seemed easy. A lot of this seemed like low-hanging fruit. One reason why we made all of these agreements was that we never thought we would be we would return to strategic competition with Russia. So yes, the risk perception was different. The cost to us and geopolitical, military, manpower, you name it, terms, was lower. The difference, though, is that many Americans, I think, deep down understand the importance of Europe. They understand the importance that the United States must remain a European power. The good news here is that it's extremely beneficial to the Europeans to have the United States active and engaged in Europe. If the United States withdraws from Europe, if the United States says, you know what, this is costing us too much, it's too hard, too complicated, we should withdraw from Europe, we're in trouble. Because think of the Franco-German relationship. The United States is the oil in the Franco-German engine of Europe. If you remove the United States from that equation, you essentially drain the oil out of an engine. And as we know, that is a really great way to have a bad day, to ruin your engine. We must keep the United States active and involved in Europe for our own interests because it lowers the risk of conflict between European states. It lowers the risk of political frictions between two of our biggest allies, Germany and France. It costs us more. But I think that's the most important lesson we need to take about the world we live in right now in 2019, and that is great power competition cannot be done on the cheap. If you want a safer world, and if you want a world where America defends its interests, you have to make the investments. So I would agree with the first part of that statement, but I would respectfully disagree with the latter.
Let's shift a little bit to the European Defense Initiative, EDI, and the U.S. military force posture in Europe. Pursuant to the 2016 Warsaw Summit, NATO enhanced its troop presence in Eastern Europe with deployments of multinational battle groups of approximately 1,200 troops each to the 3 Baltic states and Poland in an initiative called Enhanced Forward Presence. And the purpose was to support deterrence by tripwire. In testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee just last week by the U.S. European Commander, General Kurt Scaparrotti, he recommended further augmenting assigned and rotational forces in Eastern and Central Europe to deter aggression. In your assessment, how is the calibration of permanent and rotational deployments working in the Baltics, Poland, and Eastern Europe more broadly?
So we can write an entire PhD dissertation on that question.
Better get started.
Better get started. All right. So again, I like taking a historical perspective. And if we take out our watches and roll back the clock just a little bit to 2014, we can look at a world that was really, really dangerous. Russia had just invaded and illegally annexed Crimea. Fighting was ramping up in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. And we had allies looking east and getting very nervous, and then looking towards the United States and NATO. And the reason they were nervous was they correctly calculated that, well, if Russia just invaded Georgia in 2008 and they just invaded Ukraine, are we next? And what do we do to prevent any miscalculation by Russia in putting a toe over that NATO line? What do we do? Well, turns out we were exposed. We didn't have nearly enough firepower where it needed to be in order to deter any thought of aggression by Russia, low threshold hybrid or otherwise. And so that's where we got this EDI. And you know what? Bully for Congress, because Congress understood that it was important to put real money on the table to pay for the deployment of U.S. forces under Operation Atlantic Resolve. And we partnered up with other NATO forces under Operation Atlantic Resolve Northeast, which is essentially we're in Poland and our other NATO allies are in the Baltic states. And this is what we think of as tripwires. But now we have the problem, because our tripwires are pretty obvious. The Russians know exactly where our tripwires are. And if you know where a tripwire is, the danger is that you just avoid the tripwire. So this is where our thinking is now. How do we build on what we've accomplished with EDI and that enhanced forward presence by the United States and NATO and Europe? And how do we deter Russia? At the end of the day, when we talk about deterrence, what we're talking about is creating enough fear, doubt, and uncertainty in the mind of Russian war planners that they won't even try to test us in the first place. That's the nature of deterrence. And what we saw from General Scaparrotti and some others is that we're doing a good job, but we're not quite there yet. Now we have this question of what kind of force posture should we have? Should this be a permanent force posture or should it be rotational? Well, right now the Army prefers rotational. There's risks and benefits to rotational. I have been strongly supporting of permanent force posture east of Berlin, but not in the sense that we need to rebuild Ramstein in Poland. I don't think that's the right thing. But there are a lot of smart ways in which we can leverage what we already have in order to show Russia that our forces, our U.S. Army forces, are rough and ready, they're highly lethal, and if Russia thought so much of putting a toe across that NATO line, they'd have a really bad day. That's the organizing problem we have to solve right now, and I'm encouraged by some of the early steps that have been taken. I'd like to see many more, and I'd like to see, frankly, a permanent brigade stationed in Poland.
Drilling down into the question of what's been called basing in Poland, and basing's not a term that exists in the NATO-Russia Founding Act when they were talking about what's an acceptable size force. But it's been interpreted sort of like common law in the hearsay, and now it seems like the one brigade per country may have assumed a greater level of stature than was intended if the conditions of 1997 still existed. However, they clearly don't, as you've described. What goes into these discussions on setting up the permanent infrastructure that may not, as an example, a command post for a division, U.S. division, without placing a U.S. division there on a permanent basis? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we've got a couple things here. The first one is, so I'm an analyst at heart, and what I like to do is actually, if people are debating a document or an agreement, I actually like to go back and see what the original agreement said. And when you go back and see what Russia and NATO, including Germany and the United States, have already agreed to, it's actually pretty amazing stuff. The NATO-Russia Founding Act, again, which governs our strategic understanding with Russia and Europe, says that we can have a brigade in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. It's 4 brigades east of Berlin, and still not violate the agreement that we set with the Russians. Unfortunately, we don't have that many forces in the United States Army anymore. The Army is a lot smaller today than it was envisioned back in '97. So, what does this mean? How do we approach this from a practical standpoint? One of the things I've heard from my CEPA colleague, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who was former commander of U.S. Army Europe, is that he would have loved to have a divisional HQ in Poland. He had to make good with his mission command element there in Poland, but he would have loved to have a divisional HQ in Poland. And it looks like the Army is thinking along those lines. We shall see what their final decision is, but I think that's a very, very encouraging first step. We're also seeing the Army start to conceptualize not just the raw forces in Poland, but to elevate the importance of setting the theater, of making sure that any equipment or fuel stores, ammunition stores, etc., that one might need to fight a conflict, to deter Russian aggression. The Army is looking to set the theater appropriately. That means the equipment necessary for an entire brigade would be stationed in Poland. That's a great step, and I think that's absolutely necessary. As we learned from Napoleon, amateur study strategy, professional study logistics. Setting the theater is one of those raw logistical elements that will make our ability to deploy quickly, to move at the speed of relevance in a highly dynamic environment, and to show the Russian war planners that any ideas they might have about the chances of operational success on their side will fail. We do that, we deter conflict in Europe, we make Europe safer. That's what we're playing for.
Getting to the last couple questions for you here. In talking about the command and control of those U.S. troops, and specifically U.S. Army, in 2011, the rank of the U.S. Army commander in Europe, known as usurer, was reduced from 4 stars to 3 stars, while the commander of U.S. Army Pacific was elevated from 3 stars to 4 stars, pursuant to strategically questionable labeling of a pivot to the Asia Pacific. So what impact did this have on the readiness, deterrence, and allied interaction in Europe? And coupled with that, should this position be filled by a 4-star again to reflect the increased threat and attention on this vital region in which the strategic conditions have changed?
Well, as you know, I'm a big supporter of returning that post to a 4-star post. I think it's important for several reasons, least of which it communicates the strategic importance of Europe to U.S. interests. I thought the pivot, as it was laid out, was misguided. But we have a bigger problem right now, and that is, Chinese competition with China is ever so slowly going to absorb more brain power, finances, bandwidth in the Pentagon. There's no official pivot policy right now. It's happening organically. And that's something we have to come to terms with. At CEPA, one of the ways in which we've conceptualized this is to say, we must fix European defense first in order to make long-term strategic competition with China possible. Step back and think about what that means. Right now, if you're a Russian war planner, if you're a Chinese war planner, you're looking at the United States and you're making a very dangerous gamble. That calculation says, well, the Americans are overstretched, their resources are small. We could probably push them in one part of the world and they wouldn't be able to meet their commitments in another part. That must change. And that's where we're seeing an increased emphasis on burden sharing by our allies. That means our allies can and are spending, must and are spending more money on their own defense. We're seeing greater attention being paid to the kinds of equipment that needs to be fielded in order to, again, deter Russia. If we fail to fix European defense in the terms of burden sharing, allied cohesion, etc., we will not be able to compete with China long term. So that's the task that lies ahead of us for Europe. This is where the four-star issue comes into play, because it communicates to our European allies, you are an area that matters. The politics of that four-star matter. The prestige and influence of that four-star post matter. And I'm fully supportive of it, but not just for having, more chefs and not enough cooks, right? I'm in support of it because it shows the importance of Europe as a theater of strategic competition in our own U.S. interests.
Fantastic. That's a great way to close for us here. This has been a spectacular discussion. Thank you, Peter, for being with us today and for sharing your insights and experiences that are so relevant to this vital national security interest. We look forward to keeping apprised of the great work being done by CEPA.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been an honor. I'm a big fan of AUSA anyway, so it's really cool to come over here and be able to nerd out on topics that are near and dear to my heart.
Thank you. I'll look forward to doing it again sometime. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Army Matters podcast on iTunes and everywhere podcasts are found. Keep it locked here for all Army Matters and for next week's special edition episode on Army civilians. AUSA is the Army's professional association, providing a voice for the Army and support for its soldiers and families. For more information about AUSA or to become a member, visit ausa.org.